This video is created for informational purposes only. Everyone mentioned is treated with respect, and no harm or disrespect is intended. Viewer discretion is advised.
At 6 a.m. on February 4th, 1984, a restaurant manager in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, walked into what should have been an ordinary Saturday morning opening. The Roy Rogers fast food location at Lincoln Highway and Oxford Valley Road was locked from the inside. When he got the door open, he found his night manager on the kitchen floor. 25-year-old Terri Brooks was dead. The safe stood open. Money was missing. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. But when investigators examined the scene more carefully, something wasn't right. The violence didn't match the crime. A knife had been driven so hard into Terri's neck that it entered the tile floor beneath her. Her head had been wrapped in cellophane. She'd been strangled, beaten against the concrete until her skull hemorrhaged and suffocated. No thief does that. No stranger spends that much time. This was personal. But here's what made it worse. 3 hours before that manager opened the door, someone else had shown up at Terri's family home, knocking frantically, saying he was worried because her car wasn't in the parking lot. It was her fiancé, the man she was going to marry that summer. And it would take 15 years, a Philadelphia crime-solving society, and cigarette butts from a trash can to prove he was the one who killed her. Terri Lynn Brooks was born on September 13, 1958, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. By February 1984, she was 25 years old and building a future. She worked as the night manager at a Roy Rogers restaurant in Falls Township, a position with real responsibility. Roy Rogers was owned by the Marriott Corporation at the time, and for someone like Terri, this wasn't just a fast food job. It was a stepping stone to bigger opportunities, management, corporate, a career. She was engaged to Alfred Keefe, who went by Scott. They'd been together for a while, and the wedding was planned for that summer. To her family, to her friends, Scott seemed devoted. He'd come by the restaurant after closing sometimes just to sit with her while she finished paperwork. But according to later reports, things had started to change. A friend of Terri's named Francine Bradney told investigators that the relationship had become strained after Terri took the Roy Rogers job. Scott was jealous, he was possessive, and Terri was starting to feel trapped. Bradney said Terri was afraid to tell Scott she didn't want to marry him anymore. On the night of February 3rd, 1984, Terri worked her regular shift. The other employees left around 1 a.m., the way they always did. Terri stayed behind to lock up and finish the night's paperwork. It was routine. She'd done it dozens of times. Sometime after the crew left, she called Scott. They talked, then she went back to work. That phone call would later become important because it placed Scott in the timeline of that night. Now, here's what you need to understand about that restaurant layout. Once the staff left and Terri locked the doors, the only way in was if she opened them. The drive-through window was barred, the front was secured, so whoever came in that night, Terri either let them in or they had access she trusted. By the time the sun came up on February 4th, Terri Brooks was dead, and the person who'd called her just hours earlier was the first to tell her family something was wrong. Before we go further into what happened that morning, I need to say something. Cases like this, where the answer was hiding in plain sight for 15 years, don't get solved unless people keep asking questions. If this kind of story matters to you, if you believe families deserve answers no matter how long it takes, go ahead and subscribe. There are more cases like this, cases where persistence finally cracked the silence, and we're covering them all here. Around 6 a.m., the day manager arrived to open the restaurant. He noticed Terri's car was still there. That was unusual. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, he found her. But hours before that, at around 3 or 4 in the morning, Scott Keefe had shown up at the home of Terri's father and stepmother, George and Betty Brooks. He was banging on the door. Terri's sister, Vicky Bartolino, remembered that moment clearly. She told the TV show An Unexpected Killer, quote, "We heard a banging on the door and it was Scott Keefe standing here, and he's like, Terri's car's not in the driveway. Think about that for a second. Scott didn't call. He didn't wait until morning. He drove to the restaurant, noticed her car wasn't there, and then drove to her parents' house in the middle of the night to report it. Why would he check the parking lot if he thought she was home sleeping? And if he was so worried, why not call the police or call the restaurant or check her apartment? Why go straight to her family's house and announce that her car was gone? George Brooks checked Terri's bedroom. She hadn't come home. He called the restaurant manager, who said he'd go check. That's when Terri's body was found. When police arrived, they walked into a scene that looked like a robbery. The safe was open. About $1,200 to $2,500 in cash was missing, depending on which report you read. Terri's purse was knocked under a counter. Her shoes and keys were near her body. The drive-through window was partially open. But the medical examiner's report told a different story. Terri had been strangled. There were handprints on her neck. She'd been beaten so severely that her head showed signs of repeated impact against the concrete floor, causing a brain hemorrhage. A knife from the restaurant had been driven into the back of her neck, severing bone. The blade went so deep it stuck in the tile floor. Then her head was wrapped in cellophane and a trash bag was placed over it. According to the coroner, the stab wound likely paralysed her, but didn't render her unconscious. Terri Brooks was still alive when she was suffocated. Her official cause of death was asphyxiation. This was not a robbery. This was rage. Detectives on the scene noted that right away. There was no forced entry. The brutality was extreme and personal. The staging was clumsy. Whoever did this knew Terri, knew the restaurant, and wanted it to look like something it wasn't. But in 1984, DNA testing wasn't what it is today. The forensic team collected skin tissue from under Terri's fingernails and near a defensive wound on her right ring finger. They documented everything. They photographed the scene. They took fingerprints. But they couldn't extract a usable DNA profile from the evidence they had. Not yet. So they did what investigators do when the science isn't there. They started building a suspect list. Who could have done this? Police looked at everyone close to Terri. There was a co-worker named Steve who'd worked as a cook and had become what some described as a nuisance. He'd been showing up at the restaurant even on his days off, and there were reports that Terri found it irritating. When police questioned him, he couldn't provide a strong alibi. But he passed a polygraph test, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. He was ruled out. The other employees who worked with Terri that night all had alibis. They'd left together around 1 a.m. and could account for their whereabouts. Then there was Scott Keefe, the fiancé, the one who showed up at the family's house before anyone even knew Terri was dead. Police talked to him. They noted his behaviour, but they didn't have enough to charge him. No confession. No physical evidence linking him to the scene at that time. And his story, while suspicious, wasn't provably false. He said he'd talked to Terri on the phone after she locked up. That checked out. He said he got worried when he drove by later and didn't see her car. That was harder to verify, but not impossible. Without DNA, without a witness, without a confession, the case went cold. 2 weeks after Terri's murder, something strange happened. Another female assistant manager at a different Roy Rogers, also in the area, was attacked by an unknown assailant. Then a week after that, 130 miles away in Scranton, a lone female employee at a different restaurant was attacked by a man who waited until she was alone after closing. For a while, investigators wondered if there was a serial offender targeting women who worked alone at fast food restaurants. But those cases didn't match the violence of Terri's murder, and no connection was ever established. The Brooks case sat on a shelf. Terri's family grieved. Scott Keefe attended her funeral. He signed the guest book. And he moved on with his life. I want to pause here and say something. If you've ever wondered how a case this brutal, this personal, could go unsolved for over a decade, it's because the technology didn't exist yet. The evidence was there. It was collected. It was preserved. But the tools to read it weren't. That's why cases like this matter. and why we keep telling these stories. If you're someone who thinks justice shouldn't have an expiration date, hit that subscribe button. We're going to show you exactly how this case finally broke open. In 1990, a unique organization formed in Philadelphia. It was called the Vidocq Society, named after Eugène François Vidocq, a 19th-century French detective and one of the pioneers of modern criminology. The Vidocq Society wasn't a government agency. It was a private group made up of retired FBI agents, forensic psychologists, pathologists, profilers, and homicide detectives. They met once a month over lunch in a Victorian dining room and discussed cold cases that law enforcement agencies brought to them. They did this pro bono, no charge. Just a group of experts who didn't like unsolved murders. Journalist Michael Capuzzo spent years shadowing the society and later wrote a book called The Murder Room, which profiled their work. One of the cases he covered was Terri Brooks. 14 years after Terri's death, Falls Township Police Chief Arnold Connelline made a decision. He ordered the case reopened. It was 1998, and DNA technology had advanced significantly. He believed they could finally test the biological material that had been sitting in evidence since 1984. The case was brought to a Vidocq Society meeting. Officers from Falls Township laid out the details: the staged robbery, the missing cash, the overkill, the lack of forced entry. They walked the society through the evidence. And then Richard Walter stood up. Richard Walter is a forensic psychologist and one of the founding members of the Vidocq Society. He's considered one of the fathers of modern criminal profiling. And when he heard the details of Terri Brooks's murder, he told the Falls Township officers something they'd suspected all along but hadn't been able to prove. He said, according to NPR's coverage, "When you looked at the body, when you looked at the crime scene itself, it was obvious that it was not a robbery. What robbery suspect would stab someone so viciously that the knife enters the tile floor and wrap the head in cellophane? A robber is simply not going to do that. It's not efficient. There's no value in that kind of activity." Walter told them the robbery was staged. It was misdirection. Whoever killed Terri Brooks knew her, and the level of violence, the way time was spent at the scene, suggested this was personal. This was someone acting out of rage, jealousy, or control. He told them to look closer at the people in Terri's life. The Vidocq Society also asked Terri's parents about any boyfriends she'd had. They remembered one, a man they thought was named O'Keefe. Investigators searched arrest records and news articles for mentions of an O'Keefe, but nothing came up. Then someone thought to check the funeral guest book. And there it was. A signature, Alfred Scott Keefe. He'd been there all along, at the funeral, comforting the family, playing the role of the grieving fiancé. But now, investigators had a name, and they had technology that didn't exist in 1984. By 1998, Alfred Scott Keefe was 37 years old. He'd gotten married after Terri's death, had a child, gotten divorced, and moved back in with his parents in Falls Township, the same town where Terri had been killed. Investigators knew where to find him because he'd been arrested recently for driving under the influence in another jurisdiction. That arrest put him back on their radar. Now they needed his DNA, but they couldn't just ask for it. If he refused, they'd lose their shot. So they did something else. They surveilled him. Officers watched his house. They learned he smoked Newport cigarettes, a brand no one else in the house used. Then they waited. When Keefe took the trash out to the curb, investigators collected it. Inside, they found cigarette butts. They extracted DNA from those butts and sent it to the lab. The DNA matched the biological material found under Terri Brooks' fingernails in 1984. After 15 years, they finally had him, but police didn't arrest Scott immediately. They wanted to be strategic. They called him and invited him in for an interview about the case. They scheduled it for February 4th, 1999, the 15th anniversary of Terri's murder. When Scott Keefe walked into that interview room, he didn't know they had his DNA. He didn't know the cigarettes had given him up. He thought he was still safe, that he'd gotten away with it. But when detectives told him they had a match, When they laid out the evidence, the story he'd been telling for 15 years fell apart. Scott Keefe confessed. He admitted he killed Terri Brooks. According to later reports, he told investigators that Terri wanted to break up with him. That made him angry. So he went to the restaurant that night. She let him in because she trusted him. And then he attacked her. He beat her. He stabbed her. He strangled her. He suffocated her. And then he staged the scene to make it look like a robbery, taking cash from the safe to sell the story. He also admitted something chilling. He said the reason he went to her parents' house that morning, before her body was even found, was to make himself look innocent, to insert himself into the narrative as the concerned fiancé. It worked. For 15 years. This is the part of the story where I need to ask you something. How many cases do you think are sitting in evidence rooms right now, waiting for the technology to catch up? How many families are still waiting for answers because the right person hasn't looked at the file yet? If stories like this, where persistence and science finally meet, matter to you, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. What moment in this case made you realize Scott Keefe wasn't just a suspect, but the killer? Was it the early morning knock, the staged robbery, or the DNA? I'm reading every comment. On February 4th, 1999, exactly 15 years after Terri Brooks was murdered, Alfred Scott Keefe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and robbery. The case went to trial in 2000. Keefe pleaded guilty. On June 6, 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Terri's stepmother, Betty Brooks, told reporters at the time, "It's definitely a shock." The family had spent a decade and a half believing the case might never be solved. And the man who'd stood beside them, who'd mourned with them, who'd signed Terri's funeral guest book, was the one who'd killed her. Former Falls Township Police Chief Arnold Connelline, the man who ordered the case reopened, said, "It was great to be able to bring the case to a close, and we hopefully gave the family some peace." The case made headlines. The New York Times covered the arrest. So did local news outlets across Pennsylvania. Later it was featured on true crime television shows, Cold Case Files, The New Detectives, Dead of Night, An Unexpected Killer, and even the Mr. Ballon podcast. Michael Capuzzo's book The Murder Room profiled the Vidocq Society's role in pushing the investigation forward, and Richard Walter, the forensic psychologist who told Falls Township Police to look closer at someone Terri knew, later said this in an NPR interview. "In terms of interviewing an anger retaliatory type, one of the things that must be understood by the detectives is, contrary to popular opinion, the perpetrator does not feel any guilt for committing the killing. When they leave the killing site, they many times have a sense of well-being and a sense of relief because they've just had 50 pounds of emotional baggage taken off their shoulders. That explains why Scott Keefe could attend Terri's funeral, why he could comfort her family, why he could live a normal life for 15 years. Because in his mind the problem was solved. Terri was gone, and he'd gotten away with it. But he hadn't. The evidence was always there. It just took time for the science to catch up. Alfred Scott Keefe is currently 62 years old. According to Pennsylvania Department of Corrections records, he is serving his life sentence at the State Correctional Institution at Albion in western Pennsylvania. There's no parole, no early release, no second chance. He will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to Terri Brooks on February 4th, 1984. The Roy Rogers restaurant where Terri worked is no longer there. The location at Lincoln Highway and Oxford Valley Road in Falls Township has changed over the years, but the intersection remains. And for the people who remember Terri, the place will always carry her story. Her family has largely stayed out of the public eye since the trial. And that's their right. They've lived through enough. But Terri's case continues to matter. It's taught in forensic psychology courses. It's discussed in cold case seminars. It's used as an example of what happens when investigators don't give up, even when the tools they need don't exist yet. The Vidocq Society still meets monthly in Philadelphia. They still review cold cases. And they still push law enforcement to look at evidence from different angles, to challenge assumptions, to ask the questions that don't have easy answers. Because cases like Terri Brooks prove that justice doesn't always come quickly, but sometimes it comes. Terri Brooks did everything right. She worked hard. She locked the doors. She followed procedure. She trusted the man she was going to marry, and that trust cost her everything. What failed her wasn't the restaurant's security. It wasn't her instincts. It was the person closest to her, the one who should have protected her. And what saved her case 15 years later was persistence, a police chief who wouldn't let it go, a society of experts who looked at the evidence and called it what it was, and technology that finally caught up to the truth. There's no tidy lesson here, no simple takeaway. But there is this. Evidence doesn't lie. It just waits. And in Terri Brooks' case, it waited 15 years to speak her killer's name. If this story meant something to you, if you believe Terri Brooks deserved justice even after all that time, do me a favor. Share this video. Send it to someone who cares about cases like this. Because the more people who know these stories, the more pressure there is to solve the ones still sitting in filing cabinets. Justice shouldn't expire, and neither should our attention. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth doesn't disappear, it just waits for someone to find it.